a black woman, poised and ready for a long-awaited vacation, boarded her flight expecting nothing more than a smooth journey. But moments after taking her seat in first class, the atmosphere shifted. A flight attendant, unwilling to believe she belonged there, demanded proof and worse, insisted she apologize for causing confusion. What happened next stunned the entire cabin. Her husband, calmly stepping forward, revealed a truth no one saw coming, one that not only cost the crew member their job on the spot but set in motion changes that would ripple through the entire airline. Stay with me, because this story is about standing firm, the power of truth, and how one moment can challenge everything. Let me know where you're tuning in from. And if this story resonates with you, hit subscribe for more powerful stories that deserve to be told. The airport terminal was alive with the hum of collective anticipation. Voices layered over one another like threads in an intricate tapestry, stitched together by the rhythm of footsteps echoing against the polished floors. The overhead announcements crackled, guiding passengers to distant gates and fleeting destinations. In this transient space, everyone was seemingly equal bodies in motion, all moving toward some distant point on the map. But equality, as Ava Robinson had long understood, was often an illusion suspended by convenience. She approached the gate 14A, bound for Aspen with the grace of someone who had mastered the quiet power of composure. Ava's tailored navy suit was immaculate, the sharp lines emphasizing her tall frame. Her scarf, a soft lavender silk, draped effortlessly around her neck. A gift from David, she adjusted it with the same practiced ease that had carried her through countless boardrooms, where the weight of expectation sat heavily on her shoulders. Ava Robinson wasn't just a passenger, she was a woman accustomed to navigating spaces that had never been designed with her in mind. The gate agent, a young man in his early 20s, smiled politely but hesitated just long enough for Ava to notice. His eyes flickered, as if searching for an answer to a question he hadn't realized he was asking. First class? His voice lifted slightly at the end, betraying his disbelief. Yes, Ava replied, handing him her ticket. The hesitation was brief, but it hung in the air like the faint residue of smoke long after a fire had died. Ava had witnessed it too many times to mistake it for anything other than what it was. A pause, a questioning of presence, a subtle but persistent whisper that suggested she did not belong in this line. At this gate, on this flight, he scanned her ticket, the machine beeping its approval, and was about to wave her through when a figure shifted behind him. Captain Matthew Blake stepped forward, the polished brass of his uniform glinting under the fluorescent lights. He was tall, square-jawed, and carried the kind of confidence that often accompanied those who had never been told they couldn't have something. His eyes narrowed slightly as he observed Ava. "Excuse me," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Ma'am, are you sure you're at the right gate?" Ava lifted her gaze to meet his, calm but unwavering. "Quite sure," she replied. Captain Blake chuckled under his breath, a sound that did not reach his eyes. "It's just unusual," he continued, gesturing vaguely. "We don't often see first-class passengers." He trailed off, but the unfinished sentence was louder than anything he could have said aloud. Ava's grip on her handbag tightened. "Is there an issue with my ticket, Captain?" she asked, her voice smooth but laced with the sharpness of someone accustomed to cutting through condescension. The gate agent shifted uncomfortably, but Blake didn't flinch. "I'd just like to verify a few things before we allow you to board." There it was. "Before we allow you to board." Ava tilted her head slightly, as if considering the absurdity of the moment. "You're the pilot," she said, her tone measured, "not security." Blake's smirk widened, but there was no humor in it. "Let's just say I like to make sure everything runs smoothly on my flights." Ava felt the weight of the crowd's gaze settle on her. Passengers behind her exchanged nervous glances, whispering but remaining silent. Their eyes flickered toward Ava and then away, unwilling to be drawn into a confrontation that did not belong to them. If there was one thing Ava Robinson had learned, it was that silence could be louder than any protest. "If there's a problem," she said, her voice slicing through the murmurs, "I'd like to know what it is." Blake's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but his arrogance remained intact. "Security concerns," he said vaguely. "I'm sure you understand. We've had incidents lately." Ava exhaled slowly through her nose, feeling the slow simmer of anger rise, though she refused to let it boil over. "I'll contact my husband," she said, pulling out her phone. Blake's chuckle was sharper this time. "Oh, by all means," he said, "but I'm afraid no phone call will change protocol." Ava met his gaze and held it. "We'll see." She stepped to the side, dialing David's number. As she waited, the tension around the gate thickened, tightening like a coiled spring. Passengers fidgeted. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed entertained, as if watching something inevitable unfold. Captain Blake crossed his arms, leaning against the counter as though the outcome had already been decided. No one was coming to save her. That's what he thought. But Blake, like so many before him, had miscalculated. David Robinson arrived within minutes. His entrance was not loud or dramatic. It was measured, purposeful. He cut through the crowd, his tailored suit catching the terminal lights as he approached the gate. The murmur of recognition rippled through the crowd. People knew who David Robinson was. Ava stepped forward as he arrived, and for the first time since the exchange began, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. David's gaze settled on Captain Blake with the cool precision of a man who knew exactly how much power he held. "What seems to be the issue here?" David's voice was calm, but it carried the authority of someone who expected and was used to immediate answers. Captain Blake stiffened but quickly recovered. "I'm ensuring the safety of my passengers, Mr. Robinson," David said, extending his hand. David Robinson, owner of this airline. The shift was palpable. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, and Captain Blake's smirk collapsed under the weight of sudden realization. In that instant, the dynamic shifted entirely, and as David stood beside Ava, placing his hand gently on her lower back, the message was clear. Her dignity, long questioned, was no longer up for debate. David Robinson's hand rested lightly on the curve of Ava's back, but his eyes remained locked on Captain Blake, measuring him the way a seasoned player sizes up an opponent before the game begins. There was no need to raise his voice. Authority like David's didn't come from volume. It came from knowing that no matter how a situation unfolded, the ground beneath his feet remained steady. Blake shifted, the crisp fabric of his uniform barely masking the tension now seeping into his posture. His square jaw, which had seemed so rigid moments ago, tightened as if he were chewing over the predicament he'd unknowingly constructed for himself. "I was simply following procedure," Blake said, forcing a polite edge into his voice. But it was the wrong kind of polite, the forced civility of a man grasping for control he felt slipping away. David raised an eyebrow, glancing toward the gate agent, who had all but disappeared behind the desk, his head ducked low as if hoping to dissolve into the computer monitor. The crowd had grown, passengers now openly staring, sensing they were witnessing something rare. A man, accustomed to authority, standing at the precipice of its unraveling. "Is that so?" David asked, slow and deliberate. "Then why did no other first-class passengers require this level of scrutiny?" Blake hesitated, though the answer was evident to everyone present. But he couldn't say it aloud, not here. Not with the eyes of the crowd fixed so intently upon him. Ava watched the exchange with the quiet patience of someone who had lived through this scene in countless forms. This wasn't the first time a man in uniform had decided he was the gatekeeper to spaces she had rightfully earned her way into. It wouldn't be the last. But what lingered beneath these moments, what many failed to notice, was the way the rules were different. And how those differences went unspoken but widely understood. Blake's silence hung heavily in the air. A confession of sorts, though not the kind he would willingly offer. David leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough to ensure no one else but Blake could hear him. "I built this airline," David said softly, but the words carried the weight of a hammer. "I know every policy, every protocol, and nowhere does it say that a paying passenger can be denied their seat based on a whim." Blake's face flushed, but still he tried to stand his ground. "With all due respect, Mr. Robinson," he said, his words clipped, "I have the right to refuse service if I believe there's a risk to the safety of my crew and passengers." David's gaze sharpened, and Ava recognized that familiar glint in his eye, the one that warned the person across from him that they had just overplayed their hand. "And what about my wife, Captain?" David asked, his voice steady. "What risk does she pose?" "Exactly?" Blake opened his mouth, but David raised a hand, cutting him off before he could attempt to conjure another excuse. "No," David continued, "I'd like you to say it. Out loud. In front of every passenger here." Blake's mouth snapped shut. Ava shifted her weight, the soft leather of her heels pressing against the polished floor. She watched Blake closely, not out of pity, but out of curiosity. Men like him often believed they could navigate these moments through sheer arrogance alone, as if their years of unchecked behavior had built them a fortress that could not be breached. David stepped back, reclaiming his space beside Ava. The air between them electric with the unspoken exchange. "There's no need to cause a scene," Blake muttered, barely audible. David let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "The scene's already been caused," David said. "You just didn't expect to be at the center of it." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some looked uncomfortable, while others, Ava could see it in their eyes, were quietly cheering, satisfied by the rare sight of accountability taking shape in real time. But beneath it all, there was another current running through the room. Ava felt it deep in her chest. Blake was one man, but the impulse he represented, the reflex to doubt, to exclude, to assert dominance over spaces he deemed his own, was not isolated to him. This moment was a single thread in a much larger tapestry, woven through years of assumptions and small aggressions, each stitch reinforcing the last. David stepped aside and gestured toward the gate. "Board the plane, Ava," he said quietly. She hesitated for just a breath, though she wouldn't let it show. Part of her wanted to linger, to hold Blake's gaze for a little longer. She wanted him to sit with his discomfort, let it wrap around him the way it had wrapped around her so many times before. But this wasn't just for her. This was for the onlookers, the ones who watched with quiet recognition. The ones who had known this story by heart long before it ever unfolded here at Gate 14A. Ava stepped forward, handing her ticket to the trembling gate agent. He scanned it quickly, avoiding her eyes as he motioned toward the jet bridge. She paused at the entrance, turning back to Blake one last time. "I trust the flight will run smoothly, Captain," she said softly. Blake didn't respond. He couldn't. Ava smiled faintly, stepping onto the plane. The leather of the first-class seat was cool beneath her fingertips as she settled in. But the quiet hum of victory did little to soften the weight pressing against her chest. This wasn't the end. It never was. As the plane taxied down the runway, Ava stared out the window, watching the ground slip away beneath her. Somewhere out there, another gatekeeper was already waiting. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and rhythmic like the sound of a distant drumbeat. Ava Robinson reclined slightly in her seat, the leather cool beneath her fingertips. But the tension that had knotted her shoulders at the gate lingered. She could feel it still, like the faint traces of a bruise beneath the skin, hidden, but tender to the touch. David sat beside her, his eyes fixed ahead, though Ava knew his thoughts were far from the glossy magazine he held open in his lap. He hadn't spoken much since they boarded. But then again, he didn't need to. The weight of the encounter with Captain Blake sat between them, unspoken but ever present. Ava shifted, adjusting the silk scarf around her neck, as if loosening the fabric might unravel the knot in her chest. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, finally breaking the silence. David glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "Didn't I?" Ava let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "You can't fight every battle for me, David." He set the magazine aside, folding his hands in his lap. "I know that," he said, "but sometimes the fight needs more than one pair of hands." Ava turned to look at him fully, her gaze steady. "It's not just about one flight. It's not just Blake. You know that." David met her eyes, and for a long moment, they sat in silence, two people staring at the same horizon but seeing different storms brewing on the edges. The thing about men like Blake, Ava thought, was that they rarely thought of themselves as villains. He had likely walked away from the gate that day feeling aggrieved, humiliated even. He wouldn't sit in reflection, questioning his assumptions. No, he'd returned to the safety of his uniform, his badge of authority still intact, convinced that he was the one who had been wronged. That was the most dangerous part of it all. "Mrs. Robinson?" A soft voice pulled Ava from her thoughts. She glanced up to find a flight attendant standing beside her, hands gently clasped at her waist. She was young, maybe in her mid-20s, with wide eyes that flickered nervously between Ava and David. "I just wanted to apologize," the woman said, shifting slightly on her feet, "for what happened earlier at the gate. It wasn't right." Ava studied her for a moment, noting the slight tremor in her hands. "It wasn't," Ava replied calmly, "but I appreciate you saying so." The flight attendant nodded quickly. relieved, and took a half step back. But before she could leave, Ava's voice caught her. Wait. The woman paused. What's your name? Emily. She answered hesitantly. Emily. Ava repeated, leaning forward slightly. Can I ask you something? Emily nodded. Would you have said something if my husband wasn't here? The question lingered between them, delicate as glass and just as breakable. Emily's lips parted, but the answer didn't come easily. She lowered her eyes, and Ava saw it, the hesitation, the quiet conflict that Ava had witnessed in so many others over the years. I don't know, Emily admitted softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cabin. I should have, but I don't know. Ava nodded, not out of approval but out of recognition. Emily wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. That's the part that needs to change, Ava said, her voice gentle but firm. Emily swallowed and nodded, offering a small, apologetic smile before retreating down the aisle. David watched Ava quietly, his elbow resting on the armrest between them. She's young, David said. She's scared, Ava replied, and she's not alone. The truth of it settled between them. A reminder that while the confrontation with Blake had been public, the deeper conflict was often invisible, threaded into the smallest corners of everyday life. By the time they landed in Aspen, the sun had dipped low behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Ava gathered her bag, but before she could rise, David placed a hand gently over hers. You know this doesn't end here, he said softly. Ava smiled faintly, brushing her fingers over his. It never does. As they disembarked, the flight crew stood near the exit, offering polite smiles and soft farewells. Blake, of course, was nowhere to be seen. Ava stepped onto the jet bridge, but as she walked, she felt David's presence just half a step behind her, silent, steady. They moved through the terminal side by side, but the echoes of the day followed them, lingering like shadows stretching far beyond the terminal glass. Later that night, as they sat across from one another in their hotel suite, David poured them each a glass of wine. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its glow casting flickering patterns across the floor. David watched Ava carefully as she sipped from her glass, her gaze distant, fixed somewhere beyond the mountain peaks that framed the window. You're thinking about tomorrow, David said quietly. Ava nodded. Tomorrow, she would stand in front of the airline's executive board. She would recount what happened. She would explain, once again, what it meant to navigate the skies and the world with the weight of someone else's assumptions pressing down on her shoulders. But tonight, she allowed herself the smallest comfort, the warmth of David's hand resting in hers, the quiet hum of the fire, and the knowledge that even if the fight continued, she wasn't standing at the gate alone. The boardroom was cold, not from the air conditioning humming quietly in the ceiling, but from the atmosphere itself. It was the kind of cold that settled beneath the skin, that whispered this space had been shaped by decisions made long before you arrived. Ava Robinson sat at the long glass table, hands folded carefully in front of her. She had been in rooms like this before, rooms where her presence was not expected but tolerated. Tolerated in that way which suggested she could stay as long as she didn't rearrange the furniture, as long as she kept her voice measured and her demands soft. But Ava had never been interested in rearranging furniture. She wanted to burn the whole damn house down and build something better in its place. David sat at the far end of the table, silent but watchful. His presence was steady, a reminder that while Ava's name was not etched on the plaque outside the door, the influence she carried spoke louder than the brass lettering ever could. The executives filtered in slowly, some nodding politely, others avoiding her gaze altogether. They took their seats with the quiet familiarity of men who believed they owned the ground beneath their feet. Mrs. Robinson, one of the board members, greeted with a thin smile. Thank you for joining us. I understand there was an incident at the gate? Ava let the question hang for a moment, allowing the silence to fill the room. She could feel them watching her, measuring how much weight she would bring down on the table. There was, Ava replied, her voice even but firm. An incident that speaks to larger issues within the company. A slight shift. A few of them exchanged glances, the unspoken tension surfacing like steam from beneath a lid. I think you'll find, another board member interjected, that these incidents are rare. Captain Blake isn't the point, Ava interrupted smoothly. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Men like Captain Blake are a symptom, not the disease. And if you think this is rare, I can assure you that's only because you're not the one living it. A pause. She let that linger, watching as the weight of her words sank into the silence. You misunderstand, the man pressed, shifting uncomfortably. We don't condone what happened, of course. But surely we must acknowledge the pressure our pilots are under security concerns. Heightened tensions. Ava's eyes narrowed slightly, though her voice remained calm. Let me ask you something, she said, folding her hands. When was the last time any of you were stopped at the gate? When was the last time someone questioned whether you belonged in the seat you paid for? No one answered. They wouldn't. Ava exhaled quietly, glancing toward David. His gaze met hers, steady and unwavering, but he said nothing. This was her fight to lead. You call it security, Ava continued, her voice soft but deliberate. But what you're really talking about is suspicion. Suspicion that has nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with perception. She could see the shift in their faces, the discomfort, the resistance that came not from malice, but from the quiet, persistent belief that this problem was not their problem. That was the thing about racism. It rarely came dressed in white robes or shouted from burning crosses anymore. No, now it wore polished suits and sat in boardrooms, cloaked beneath policy, quietly nodding in agreement while ensuring the doors remained half shut. One of the younger board members, a woman in her 40s, cleared her throat. I agree that what happened was unacceptable, she said carefully, but overhauling the entire company culture is a complicated process. It takes time. Ava smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. You misunderstand again, she replied. I'm not asking for time. I'm telling you that the time you think you have is already gone. Another ripple of silence. David leaned forward slightly, speaking for the first time. Ava's not here to suggest changes, he said quietly. She's here to implement them. A few of the men shifted, the faintest glimmer of resistance still lingering in the air. But David's words had planted something else alongside its certainty. Effective immediately, Ava continued, seizing the moment. All leadership will undergo bias and diversity training. And I mean all leadership, including pilots, senior staff, and board members. The older man who had first spoken frowned. Mrs. Robinson, with all due respect, Ava cut in gently, is why we're having this conversation at all. She let her gaze sweep the table, daring any of them to push back further. David had told her once that power was not something men like these surrendered willingly. You had to take it from them, quietly but firmly, until they realized you had been holding it all along. Another pause stretched across the room. Finally, the woman, the younger board member, nodded. I think Mrs. Robinson is right, she said. This isn't about one pilot. It's about a system that's been in place for far too long. A crack, the first one. Ava didn't smile, but she felt it, a shift in the air. Subtle but significant. The older man let out a breath, folding his hands as if conceding the argument. Very well, he muttered. We'll begin the process, but I hope you understand the scale of what you're asking. Ava stood, smoothing her jacket. I understand perfectly, she said. The question is, do you? As she left the boardroom, David rose and followed behind her, his hand brushing against the small of her back in quiet solidarity. They'll fight it, David murmured as they walked down the long corridor, the polished floors echoing beneath their steps. They always do, Ava replied, but as the boardroom doors closed behind her, Ava knew that something had shifted. Maybe not the whole house, no. Not yet. But a match had been struck, and the smoke, however faint, had already begun to rise. The thing about fire is that it doesn't always roar. Sometimes it smolders quietly, eating away at the edges long before anyone smells the smoke. For weeks after that board meeting, the flames flickered just beneath the surface. Ava Robinson could feel it, the subtle resistance coiling in the silence of emails left unanswered, in the faint shift of eyes during meetings when she spoke. It wasn't outright rebellion. No one dared to oppose her openly, not with David's name etched in gold on the company letterhead. But there were other ways to say no without speaking at all. She saw it in the reports. 3 department heads had yet to schedule their mandatory bias training. A handful of pilots, senior staff, as they liked to call them, had quietly filed complaints, citing the inconvenience of the new policy. Meetings were pushed, rescheduled, or worse, held without her. These were the men who smiled to her face but left the door ajar when she walked away, ensuring that behind it, the old world still lingered. Ava's phone vibrated softly against her desk. "David," she answered, leaning back in her chair. "I heard about the pilots." His voice carried that quiet anger she recognized, well controlled, but simmering just beneath the surface. "They'll either take the training or they won't fly," she replied, keeping her tone even. David let out a breath on the other end. "You know they'll push this as far as they can. Let them," Ava said. "I don't mind breaking their wings." She could almost hear the smile in David's pause, but it didn't linger long. "I'm proud of you, Ava," he said softly. Ava closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing his words to settle. "I know," she whispered, "but this isn't pride work. This is survival work." The first real test came 2 days later. Gate 27. A black man in his early 40s, sharply dressed, holding a briefcase that looked as if it cost more than the monthly salary of the gate agent standing in front of him. Ava watched the security footage from her office, the muted image unfolding like a play she had seen too many times before. The agent, Clara, her name tag read, stood rigid, lips pressed into a thin line as she pointed toward the man's ticket. Ava couldn't hear the exchange, but she didn't need sound to understand the scene. His shoulders squared slightly, a gesture of quiet defiance. Her stance mirrored it, hands on hips, firm in the authority her uniform granted. And there it was, the pause. Ava knew it well, the same pause that lived at gate 14A. The pause that meant, "I don't think you belong here." Ava rose from her desk, slipping on her blazer with the same precision as an armor plate. By the time she reached the gate, the crowd had begun to gather. Not large, but large enough. These moments, Ava knew, had a way of pulling people in, curiosity mixed with that ancient, unspoken desire to witness confrontation as long as they could watch from the edges, untouched by the heat. "Is there a problem here?" Ava's voice sliced clean through the tension, scattering it like wind against smoke. Clara's head snapped up, her mouth parting slightly as her eyes darted to Ava's name tag. Recognition dawned slowly, like sunlight bleeding over a cold horizon. "No, ma'am," Clara said quickly. Too quickly. Ava's eyes shifted to the man standing across from her. "I was told my ticket needed additional verification," he explained, his tone measured but sharp. His name, according to the boarding pass he still held firmly in his hand, was Anthony Carter. Ava nodded once. "Your ID and ticket are valid?" "Yes." She turned back to Clara, lifting an eyebrow. "Is there a reason Mr. Carter isn't on that plane right now?" Clara hesitated. Ava held her gaze, unblinking. Finally, Clara shifted nervously and gestured toward the boarding tunnel. "It was just a misunderstanding, Mrs. Robinson." Ava nodded again. "Good, because misunderstandings like this will not happen under my watch." She didn't say the rest aloud, but the silence left plenty of space for it. "Not anymore." Mr. Carter inclined his head slightly as he walked past, his steps slow and deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who had been forced to explain his presence in spaces too many times before. Clara's shoulders dropped as the crowd thinned, dispersing now that the moment had passed. "Clara," Ava said softly. The young woman stiffened, bracing for the inevitable reprimand. "You'll attend additional training," Ava continued, "and if this happens again, you'll find yourself explaining it to our." "Understood?" Clara's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." Ava nodded and turned to leave, the faint burn of frustration still simmering in her chest. That evening, David found her in the kitchen, a glass of red wine already waiting on the counter for her. "I saw the report from gate 27, he said, pouring himself a glass. Ava exhaled, leaning against the counter. "I thought the policies would be enough. I thought if we wrote the rules down, made them plain, they'd follow them." David studied her for a moment. "You can change policy, Ava, but you can't rewrite people's hearts overnight." Ava swirled the wine in her glass, watching the deep red liquid coat the inside like paint. "I don't need to change their hearts," she replied quietly. "I just need them to know there are consequences for standing still." David raised his glass. "To moving forward," he said. Ava lifted hers in return. "To making sure no one else waits at the gate." The clink of their glasses echoed softly in the quiet kitchen. The winter morning settled heavily over the city, a cold, steel-gray light filtering through the large windows of Ava Robinson's office. The glass reflected back more than just the skyline. There was something else there. Something harder to name. Ava sat at her desk, staring at the report that lay open before her. It wasn't long. A few paragraphs detailing the incident at Gate 27. The language was clinical, stripped of the discomfort that had settled into the pit of her stomach the moment she saw Anthony Carter standing at that gate. Misunderstanding during passenger verification process. Resolved without incident. Those words felt like ash in her mouth. Ava had learned a long time ago that nothing about these encounters was ever truly without incident. The knock at her door was soft, almost tentative. "Come in," Ava said, closing the report with a deliberate slowness. The door opened, and Emily, the young flight attendant from a few weeks prior, stepped inside. Her hands clasped in front of her like she was holding something fragile. "Mrs. Robinson," Emily began, her voice quiet but resolute. "I know you're busy, but could I speak with you for a moment?" Ava gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Of course." Emily sat, smoothing the hem of her uniform nervously. "I've been thinking a lot about that day," she said, her eyes fixed on her hands. At the gate, with Captain Blake, Ava's gaze softened. She could see the weight Emily carried. The way it settled in the slight hunch of her shoulders. In the way she measured each word before releasing it. "I should have said something sooner," Emily admitted, finally lifting her eyes. "But I didn't, and I guess I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Ava leaned forward slightly, folding her hands on the desk. "Emily, do you know why I asked for your name that day?" Emily hesitated, shaking her head. "Because I wanted you to remember that moment," Ava said gently. "Not so you'd feel ashamed, but so you'd recognize the choice you'll have the next time it happens. And it will happen again." Emily's eyes glistened faintly, but she blinked it away. Nodding. "I'm trying," she whispered. "That's all any of us can do," Ava replied. But even as she spoke those words, Ava felt the sharp pang of doubt twisting at the edges of her resolve. Trying wasn't always enough. Later that afternoon, Ava found herself in the employee lounge, her cup of tea growing cold on the table beside her. The television mounted on the wall flickered with images of breaking news: another airline. Another story that felt all too familiar. A black family denied boarding. The gate agent's words hung in bold print along the bottom of the screen. "We have to make sure everyone belongs here." Ava's fingers tightened around the handle of her cup. It was an odd thing how the language of exclusion had learned to dress itself in softer tones. Gone were the days of open hostility. Now, prejudice wrapped itself in policy, cloaking suspicion in the language of safety and regulation. She felt David's presence before she saw him, his shadow stretching across the floor as he stepped into the room. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "I saw the story." Ava set the cup down carefully. "It's always the same story. Just different faces." David pulled out the chair across from her, lowering himself into it with the weight of someone who had fought too many of these battles already. "We're making progress," he said, but even as he spoke, Ava could hear the quiet doubt lining his voice. "Are we?" she asked softly. David met her gaze, searching for the conviction he knew she usually carried so effortlessly. But today, she felt hollow. "I thought if we made the rules clear enough, if we laid it all out, people would follow them," Ava said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "But they find ways around the rules. They always do." David was silent for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the table between them. "They can find ways around the rules," he said carefully, "but they can't find their way around you." Ava lifted her eyes, and for the briefest second, she saw it, the fire David always saw burning in her, even when she felt extinguished. "I'll keep pushing," she said finally. David smiled faintly, nodding. "I never doubted that." A week later, the fire found its way back to her doorstep. It was late when Ava's phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She answered out of habit, balancing the phone against her shoulder as she sifted through paperwork. "Mrs. Robinson?" "Yes," she replied, her focus still on the documents in front of her. "This is Anthony Carter. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Ava froze, the pen slipping from her fingers. "No," she said quickly. "Not at all." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Ava almost thought he might hang up. "I just wanted to thank you," Anthony said finally, "for what you did at the gate." Ava's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "You don't have to thank me for that." "But I do," he replied, "because no one ever has before." Ava exhaled slowly, her chest tightening. "It shouldn't have to be like this," she said softly. "No," Anthony agreed, But until it isn't, I'm glad there are people like you in those rooms. After the call ended, Ava sat alone in her office. The city lights flickering beyond the window. The weight of the day lingered. But this time, it felt just a little lighter. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion, the fire began to smolder once again. Ava Robinson had been in this room before. Not this exact boardroom, but ones like it, spaces lined with long, polished tables and tall-backed leather chairs where the air was thick with the quiet arrogance of men who believed that time, if left alone, would solve all problems. She knew the weight of rooms like this. The weight of their silences. Their half-measured nods. Their carefully chosen words that carried no real intention. But Ava was tired of silences. She stood at the head of the table, hands resting lightly on the surface, though nothing about her posture suggested ease. I know some of you aren't happy to see me here again. She began, letting her eyes drift across the room, taking in the faint flickers of resistance that darted behind the eyes of several board members. I'm sure some of you thought this conversation ended last month. No one spoke, but she saw the shifting in their seats, the subtle crossing of arms, the quiet language of discomfort. Ava let the silence stretch. That's the problem, she said finally, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. You thought this was a conversation. But it's not. Her eyes settled on Richard Harris, a senior executive whose polite skepticism had followed her through every meeting since the first policy change. It's a decision, she said, leaning in just slightly, one that will be implemented whether you like it or not. Richard's mouth tightened, his knuckles whitening as he clasped his hands together on the table. With all due respect, Mrs. Robinson, Richard began, his voice slow, measured like a man building a wall brick by brick. We're running a business, not a social experiment. We can't afford to alienate long-standing employees with policies that feel more like punishments than improvements. Ava's gaze didn't waver. Punishment, she repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. She straightened, clasping her hands behind her back as she began pacing slowly along the length of the table. Let me tell you about punishment, Mr. Harris. The room was still. Punishment is being questioned at every gate despite the validity of your ticket, she said, her voice soft but unrelenting. Punishment is having to explain over and over again why you belong in spaces you've paid for. It's watching men like Captain Blake make decisions that strip people of their dignity and then walk away untouched. Her footsteps echoed softly as she moved. The only people who feel punished by accountability are the ones who were never held accountable to begin with. A few board members shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward Richard, waiting for his response. But Richard said nothing. Ava returned to her place at the head of the table, letting the silence settle like dust. I'm not asking you to agree with me, she said finally, her voice dropping lower. I'm telling you what's going to happen next. David watched quietly from the far end of the room, his gaze steady but unreadable. He knew Ava didn't need him to step in. This was her fight and she was winning it. After the meeting, Richard lingered. Ava noticed him standing near the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him as he stared out over the city. You've made quite a name for yourself, Richard said without turning. Ava crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway. I wasn't trying to. He glanced at her, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. That's usually how it happens. For a brief moment, the tension between them softened but it didn't disappear. Richard exhaled, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. You know, I don't disagree with you. Ava raised an eyebrow. But? He turned to face her fully. But change like this, it doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't happen without cost. Ava stepped forward, closing the space between them. I'm well aware of the cost, she said quietly. But it's not the people at the top who pay it. Is it? Richard studied her for a long moment before nodding. No, he admitted. It's not. Later that evening, Ava found herself sitting alone in the quiet of her living room. A glass of wine untouched on the table beside her. David entered, loosening his tie as he approached, his gaze softening when he saw the weariness in her expression. Rough day? He asked. Settling beside her, Ava leaned into him, letting her head rest against his shoulder. They're not ready, David. David's arm slipped around her waist, his thumb brushing gently over her wrist. They weren't ready when you started this, he reminded her, but they're further along now than they were then. Ava closed her eyes. There are days, she murmured, when it feels like nothing has changed. David pressed a kiss to her temple. And there are days when it feels like everything has. Ava let the quiet surround them, the faint crackle of the fire filling the room. She knew the truth. Progress didn't roar. It smoldered slow and quiet until one day, the whole house caught flame. Ava Robinson's reflection in the glass of the terminal window looked back at her with tired eyes. The early morning light crept along the floor, inching toward her heels, but even the rising sun felt heavier than it should. David stood a few feet away, speaking quietly into his phone. His silhouette stretched long against the terminal floor, as if the weight of the moment made him taller. Ava listened without meaning to, catching the low murmur of his voice as he arranged another round of meetings, this time with legal. There had been another complaint. Captain Blake had filed suit. A wrongful termination claim. Ava wasn't surprised. Men like Blake rarely accepted consequences with grace. They didn't see accountability, they saw betrayal. "You expected this," David said, slipping his phone into his pocket as he returned to her side. Ava nodded, arms crossed, fingers gripping her elbows as though she could hold herself together by force. "I did," she replied, "but knowing doesn't make it easier." David's hand rested gently on the small of her back, his touch grounding her. "You were right to fire him," he said softly. "I know," Ava answered, but the words felt hollow. She remembered the look on Blake's face that day, the simmering disbelief in his eyes as security escorted him from the gate. She remembered the tight-lipped men in the boardroom, the ones who agreed with her in silence but whispered behind closed doors. And now Blake's suit had given them all something to cling to. She could already hear it, the thinly veiled arguments. Maybe this was handled too harshly. Maybe we should reconsider the new policies. Maybe Ava Robinson had overstepped. David must have seen it in her expression. "Let them push," he said, his voice steady. "They'll lose." Ava turned to him, eyes narrowing slightly. "They don't need to win," she replied. "They just need to make enough noise. Noise like this sticks, David. It stains." He didn't answer immediately, but his hand didn't leave her back. Ava sighed, turning to watch the planes lift into the sky outside the window. "Do you know what the hardest part is?" she asked quietly. David waited, sensing she wasn't looking for a quick answer. "It's not the fight," Ava continued. "It's how normal all of this feels. Like we're walking the same path our parents did. Like we're stuck in some loop, replaying the same arguments, dressing them in new words but knowing it's the same damn thing." David nodded, and for a moment, his own shoulders seemed to bear that weight. "Maybe we are," he admitted, "but someone has to walk it. And if we don't, who will?" Ava exhaled, closing her eyes briefly. By the time the lawsuit reached the public, the headlines had already chosen sides. Ex-Captain sues airline for wrongful termination, cites discrimination in reverse. The absurdity of it would have made Ava laugh if not for the knot it twisted in her stomach. She sat in her office late into the night, rereading the statements Blake's lawyer had released. Words like unfair, vindictive, and targeted dotted the pages. Blake wasn't defending his actions, he was framing himself as the victim of her ambition. A knock on her door pulled her from the haze. Emily, the young flight attendant, peeked inside. "Mrs. Robinson?" Ava straightened, offering a small smile. "Emily, come in." The girl hesitated at first, lingering at the doorway. Ava recognized that hesitation, the quiet conflict of someone unsure whether they belonged in the room. Emily stepped forward, gripping a newspaper in her hand. Emily hesitated, as if deciding whether to speak at all. "I saw the articles." Ava nodded, gesturing toward the seat across from her. "You and the rest of the country." Emily didn't sit. "I wanted to say something," she said, voice tight, "about that day at the gate." Ava folded her hands in her lap, giving her space to speak. "I froze," Emily admitted, "when Captain Blake was questioning you. I saw it happening, and I just froze." Ava's expression softened. "Emily, you..." "No," Emily interrupted, her eyes meeting Ava's with an intensity that surprised them both. "I should have said something. I should have done more. I can't stop thinking about it." Ava leaned forward slightly, her voice low. "You're not the only one who froze that day. There were dozens of people standing there, and not one of them spoke up." Emily's grip on the newspaper tightened. "But I'm not them," she said quietly. "I want to be better." Ava's eyes held hers, reading something in Emily's face, something rare. "Then next time, speak," Ava said softly. "It's not about being perfect, Emily. It's about not letting the moment pass you by again." Emily nodded, blinking away the heaviness that had settled in her eyes. I will, she promised. Ava smiled faintly. Good, she said, because there will always be a next time. Blake's lawsuit was dismissed within weeks. The court cited insufficient evidence. And while the victory felt like a breath of fresh air, Ava knew better than to celebrate. Men like Blake didn't fade quietly. And neither did the system that produced them. But as Ava watched Emily work the next flight, handling passengers with a quiet confidence she hadn't carried before, she felt something shift. Small, but real. It wasn't the fire that changed things. It was the people who learned how to carry it forward.